Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Glad to have with us today a longtime former Tribune writer, a name you'll all recognize, I'm sure, Fred Voss, with us today to talk about his new book, My House Was Not a Home. Fred Voss, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, I want to start out, giving kind of, I don't want to say refresher, but let's talk about your Tribune years. What years were you with the Hornell Evening Tribune, Fred Voss?
Oh, from 1986 through 1988, and then I went back again in the 80s for a couple of years. And then I left and did something else. Then I went back again in 2004 and worked for another 10 years selling travel guide ads.
Right, the travel guide ads. Remember that. The article that sticks out the most from the 80s was seeing a Tribune, and it talked about Ed Meese. And it said, the headline was Ed Meese, the Sleaze Factor. Were you, and Ed Meese, of course, was a Reagan administration official. Were you for Meese or against Meese? I can't remember how that went.
Everything I read, there was the undertones that he was a lowlife. So I wasn't really in his favor at all. I was hoping Reagan would find somebody else to take his place, but
yeah, that was the big word that they used to use, Meese and sleaze together. Kind of rhymed.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. Sleazy Meesey, yeah.
So that would have gone back to probably 1986, 1987, around Iran-Contra time.
Right, yeah, that's right.
And that would be interesting to see if Fred brought his new book up, but he also brought the News Hawk reports, which are a collection of his a lot of his older writings from the Tribune. Let's see. Looking through some of these, let's see. Barack Obama's Christmas Carol, The Death of Bin Laden, Doing It the American Way, Enemies Everywhere. Looks like you have a view from the middle. Looks like you have quite a lot of interesting articles that you wrote. They're not dated, Fred, but you can kind of guess when looking through the Newshawk Report's book, the period that they're from. Am I right there?
Yeah, there's basically they follow one another, but there's some mistakes when they put it together. But I didn't think it was any big trouble because who in the heck was going to know, So
a Fred Voss historian would have picked that up, but who else? Talking to Fred Voss, the longtime Tribune writer, here on today's Newsmaker show. Let's talk about your new book here. My House Was Not a Home. What's the book about, and what made you want to write it, Fred Voss?
Well, I grew up in kind of sad circumstances. I grew up on a farm in Northern California, and I had gone up there with my family, my supposed adopted family, and I was supposed to visit Grandma and Grandpa on the farm for the summer. And, of course, my family was supposed to come and get me at the end of the summer, but they didn't. They left me up there with Grandma. And turned out Grandma liked to drink, and she was a slugger. She liked to beat up little boys.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
So I wanted to get out that the book isn't about abuse. It's about the people who helped me avoid the abuse.
You had some relatives or friends who rescued you from an unfortunate situation?
No relatives. I made a lot of friends, though. A lot of people were seeing what was happening at the house and were on my side. Of course, back in those days, there was no such thing as child abuse. So, if a kid had bruises on his body, it was because he had done something bad and he got a beating, and that was the end of it. Nowadays, if somebody saw that, they'd throw your mother or your grandmother in jail, But back in those days, there was no jail for grandma,
Yes, that's a tough situation. Talking to Fred Voss, the longtime Evening Tribune reporter. My house was not a home. He's just written it. Let's see. You talk about To Hell and Back, the man who invented dinosaurs. Rufus, a pal for the ages. Was Rufus a dog, I'm guessing?
Rufus is a dog, yeah. He was my pal for a couple of years, and then he disappeared. He showed up off the highway. Most of the dogs we had came down the highway and were abandoned by somebody along the way. And they all came to the house and wanted, they were hungry and tired and looking for some friendship, and I gave it to them. And so they'd stick around. And unfortunately, most of them went back on the highway and were hit, and that was the end of them.
Oh, that's sad, but being up here in the country road here, County Route 64, Ashbaugh Hill, quite aware of the whole situation with dogs getting struck by a vehicle. Talking to Fred Voss today here on the Newsmaker show. And tell us about the chapter on Narrow Escape.
Narrow Escape. Well, next door to the farmhouse was a peach orchard, rather large. And at one end of the peach orchard, there was a bunch of pigs, sows and young pigs. And my foster grandmothers used to send me into this orchard to pick up soggy peaches that she could make jelly out of. I guess soggy peaches were the best way to make jelly. So I had to go in there with boxes and fill the boxes up so she could make jelly, and then she'd trade it with her buddies for legs of lamb or whatever. It was a big trading thing that went on there in Tehama County, California. Not too many people had a lot of money, so a lot of trading took place. And one day I was in there picking these soggy peaches out of this tree, and I kind of lost track of time, and I looked down, and there was this huge sow who was looking up at me. And I said, oh, wow, I got to get out of here. And she wasn't going to let me out of the tree. And finally I tricked her and jumped out of the tree and headed for the fence. Well, the tree was pretty much in the middle of the orchard. So anyway I went, it was a long way to go. And she was catching up with me. And my dog, Rufus, this was Rufus, he found he couldn't get into the orchard at first because they dug down into the ground with the wire. There was a wire underneath that the pigs couldn't root under. But he finally found a way in. He had to go quite a ways, and he showed up and he started barking and attacking the sow to keep the sow away from me. And it became pretty hairy because after a while the sow wasn't afraid of the dog anymore. And slowly but surely we made our way toward the fence, and just as I was about ready to make a break for it, the sow grabbed Rufus's front leg and bit it and broke the leg. And so I had to go back and save my dog because he saved me. So I went back and tried to get him away from the sow, and that didn't work out too well. But then he all of a sudden lunged from me and went after the sow and tore the dickens right out of her ear. All she had left was just a couple of flaps there, and she was screaming to beat the band. And I grabbed him by his collar, ran for the fence, picked him up as best I could, threw him over the fence, and then just as I was crawling over the fence, I got stuck in the barbed wire, and I'll be damned if the sow didn't come at me, and she missed me by about an inch before I fell over the fence into our yard.
Ooh.
And there was my foster grandmother saying, "Where have you been? I wanted this box of peaches filled by now." And I told her, I says, "Look, get in the car. We're taking the dog to the vet." And I was only 6, 7 years old, but I get a little tired of her, and the dog needed medical attention, so we got the dog to town, and he survived.
And we're talking with Fred Voss today here on the Newsmaker Show about his latest book. Got to take a quick break, then we'll check the forecast. Stay with us.
Doors are being slammed in your face, and bad credit is holding you back from buying a house, car, even getting a credit card. $99 can put your credit back to a 720 or higher. Bankruptcy, tax liens, judgments, and even late pays can be removed from credit reports by calling the Giving Days Foundation. 800-543-5772. Don't miss this great free credit repair. Just be one of the first 10 callers. 800-543-5772.
Rainy days and Mondays never bring him down. He's meteorologist Rob Carolyn.
Oh, listen to Karen Carpenter here. Wow. Weather-wise this morning, Brian, it's a little soggy out there. Yep, a rainy day and a Monday going together. But the good news is this is the worst of the weather for the entire work week. Once we get this frontal system out of here later this evening, some very nice weather is going to build in behind it and set the stage for a pretty decent Tuesday, and then really nice weather Wednesday through Friday. So this is it. A lot of cloudiness with some steady rain this morning. It may come down hard at times. It'll taper off to showers this afternoon. It's going to be cool, 55 to 60 today. The showers are out of here tonight. We'll have lingering cloudiness overnight. We're 40 to 45. Tomorrow, high pressure heads our way from the Great Lakes and the Dakotas. Sunshine will develop. It'll be 60 to 65 tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow night, clear cold, 35 to 40. Sunny, 60 to 65 Wednesday. And we're sunny in the 60s Thursday and Friday, too. Sunrise this morning was at 7:14. It'll set tonight at 6:43, Brian.
And we're back with longtime Hornell Tribune writer Fred Voss. And skimming through both books here, the Newshawk Reports and My House Was Not a Home. That's Fred's new book, My House Was Not a Home. He wrote a book several years ago called The Newshawk Reports, a collection of writings by Fred Voss, a longtime local writer for the Tribune. So it's going through the Newshawk essays book. This is kind of interesting. It talks about you enjoyed watching Western movies. John Wayne, you say, Clint Eastwood, and Tom Selleck, your favorite Western actors. Western movies evoke a wonderful time in American history, you write. And I'm kind of curious, does growing up in California have anything to do with that?
I don't know. I've just always been a little bit attracted to the Old West.
Oh, sure.
If I'd have had a choice of which era of American history to grow up in, I probably would have picked sometime between 1850 and 1900, and became a gunfighter or something. You know, I think it would have been really cool to have been a fast draw guy.
We used to have an announcer here in the 1980s and 90s, a morning man, Gary Gray. He came here after being in Los Angeles and other cities, and one of the things that he used to do was play bit parts in old Western movies. Because, you know, the radio guys in those days would often get to know the movie guys, which is that's actually how Bob Crane got to know Bing Crosby. Bob Crane, who worked here at one point. Bob Crane got to know Bing Crosby, and that's how he made the jump into television, eventually landing a spot on Hogan's Heroes.
Really? No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Bob Crane was here in the year 1950 at WLEA.
Really, huh?
Yeah, we don't have any air checks of him, and they likely wouldn't survive. The old reel-to-reels if they go back that far, are kind of warbly sounding and difficult to, they still exist, but when you play them back, you really can't understand what they're saying. Records, no problem, but reel-to-reels,
Yeah, right.
Tape just does not survive in that way.
Oh.
Talking to Fred Voss here on today's Newsmaker show. He's written a new book called My House Was Not a Home. And there's a chapter here called Harry. Tell us about that, Fred Voss.
Oh, Harry was another one of our dogs. He showed up when I came home from school one day. I used to ride the school bus, and the bus would let me off right there at the end of the driveway. And then there was a mailbox, and back of the mailbox was a big tree. And around the tree was a lot of tall grass growing. And I got off the bus and I heard this kind of whining sound. So I looked around and I saw this old basset hound laying in the woods, in the grass. And he looked like he'd been abandoned, like so many of the other dogs that came our way. So I coaxed him to his feet, and he just barely made it up to the house. He was that bad off. He was his legs weren't good, and he had a big sway in his back, and he probably was 100 years old. So I didn't have another dog at the time, so I tried to get Harry to go down to the woods with me. There was a slough next to the house, which was kind of a deep spot where a stream ran through in the wintertime. And there was a lot of trees down there, and I tried to get him to go down there and go hunting gargoyles and mammoths and gigantic dinosaurs with me. And he'd go down in there, and then I'd be scouting out in front, trying to tell him what to look out for, and I'd turn around and he'd be gone. And I'd walk back to the house, and there he was laying in the shade under a tree. Well, this went on till I finally got to the point where I just decided that Harry wasn't going to go on picnics with me. So,
yeah, a lot of the book seems to be about dogs. Friggin' Voss. You even have a chapter called "A Dog's Sixth Sense."
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, this dog showed up in the backyard one day, and he was hungry. You could tell he just sat there, and I gave him something to eat, and he left. And he showed up again the next morning, and he was hungry, and so I gave him something to eat. Well, this went on for about a week or so, and finally, one time it was on a weekend, I remember, and I walked out the back door, and I could see him walking out across a field out in back of the house. So I decided I was going to follow him and see where he went. And right in back of us was the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. The mountains were right there. I mean, they almost looked like you could throw a rock and hit one, but they were a lot further away than you thought they were. And so I started following him, and he went way up these the foothills to this ledge, and there was a cabin up there, and outside the cabin was a grave. It was a mound there where somebody had been buried. I assume the owner of the cabin had died, and somebody buried him there. And this dog all of a sudden just turned kind of nasty and growled at me, didn't want me around. And so I left, and I didn't go back up there until I was in the barber shop. That's where most of my friends were.
Yeah, you talk about your friends in the book. There's Jimmy and Skinny and the Downies.
Yeah. And a lot of guys in the barber shop. Older men. They were older men, and they liked me because I was courteous, and I didn't do everything they did, like drink moonshine and smoke and cuss. I didn't do any of that stuff. So they liked me. They thought I was a hell of a good kid.
Yeah, you have another chapter here, Moonshine and Poker.
That's a long chapter. Has to do with some kind of underhanded deals that went on there with people making moonshine, and it turned out that and people were going and destroying other people's moonshine setups, and it turned out that it was a bunch of women who wanted to steal some of the business. But none of them had husbands anymore, and they needed some kind of an income. And they were going around destroying the moonshine setups of these men. And the men, of course, thought it was other guys. And they finally found out it was women who was doing this. And they went and with an axe and sledgehammers and whatnot and took care of business. Put the ladies out of business temporarily.
We've been talking to Fred Voss. He's a local, longtime Tribune writer and salesman, and now retired. He's written some books here. Let's see. One of them is a collection of his writings, the Newshawk Reports. The new one is My House Was Not a Home. How do we get My House Was Not a Home, Fred?
Well, I lived in the house with these people.
No, how do we order the book, I meant?
Amazon.
Amazon.com.
Amazon.com.
Just go to Amazon.com and go to the search engine and type in Fred Voss. My House Was Not a Home.
Right.
Okay, Fred. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming in on Newsmaker.
Thanks for having me.
It's AM 1480 WLEA Hornell. Kill Meets next.